152 passengers board Airblue Flight 202 on a quiet July morning in Karachi. To them, it's just another short domestic trip to Islamabad, 2 hours at most, nothing unusual. The aircraft waiting at the gate is an Airbus A321, a modern and reliable jet that has flown tens of thousands of hours without issue. On paper, this flight should be routine. At the controls is Captain Pervez Iqbal Chowdhury. At 61 years old, he's one of the airline's most senior commanders, boasting more than 25,000 hours in the air. Sitting beside him is First Officer Muntajib Ahmed Chugtai, much younger, a former F-16 fighter pilot who is still adjusting to the world of commercial aviation. Two pilots, two very different levels of experience, and two very different mindsets. From the very beginning, the atmosphere inside the cockpit feels off. Instead of calm cooperation, the captain treats the flight like an exam. He quizzes his co-pilot relentlessly, mocking him when answers don't come fast enough. "Don't you know anything about this either?" he snaps at one point. The first officer, once confident in the military, now grows quieter and more hesitant with every passing minute. What should have been teamwork is quickly turning into a one-sided performance. The cockpit becomes tense, dominated by a captain who is more interested in authority than collaboration. And while the passengers sit back expecting a normal flight, the seeds of disaster are already being planted in silence at the front of the aircraft. Because this flight would not be lost to weather or mechanical failure, it would be lost to a breakdown in the very place designed to keep everyone safe: the cockpit. As Flight 202 nears Islamabad, the weather is already working against them. Heavy fog hangs over the city, rain sweeps across the hills, and visibility drops so low that even the outline of the Margala Hills disappears into the clouds. For pilots, this isn't unusual. Islamabad's runway 12 doesn't have an instrument landing system. The standard procedure is clear. First line up with the opposite runway, 30, using instruments, then perform a circling maneuver to visually approach runway 12. It's a routine dance, safe, but only if the crew can actually see the airport. But Captain Chaudhry doesn't like waiting. Instead of flying the published pattern, he comes up with his own plan. He programs some fake waypoints into the aircraft's computer, imaginary markers that don't exist on any chart. Then he lets the autopilot fly toward them in nav mode, a function designed for long cruise segments, not low-altitude circling. The first officer knows something isn't right. "But are we visual?" he asks cautiously, reminding the captain that they need sight of the runway before attempting this maneuver. The captain brushes it off, pressing ahead as if nothing is wrong. In that moment, the crew is no longer flying the aircraft according to procedure. They're flying according to one man's improvisation. The Airbus is descending into worsening weather, following a computer path that was never meant to exist. And with every mile, the walls of terrain around Islamabad are closing in. By the time Flight 202 descends toward Islamabad, the risks are already stacking up. The published minimum altitude for the circling approach is 2,500 feet. Drop lower than that without the runway in sight, and you're flying blind in dangerous terrain. But Captain Chaudhry pushes the aircraft down to 300 feet, 200 feet below safety limits. In the cockpit, air traffic control suggests a holding pattern, a safe way to wait out the weather. The captain scoffs at the idea. "Let him say whatever he wants. We'll keep going," he mutters to his first officer. The tension is suffocating. The first officer finally warns, "Sir, the terrain must be very close." And he's right. Seconds later, a shrill alarm fills the cockpit. The enhanced ground proximity warning system, EGPWS, repeats the same urgent command. "Terrain ahead, pull up. Terrain ahead, pull up." Any pilot knows this warning is not negotiable. The only correct move is an immediate climb at maximum power. But instead of reacting, the captain presses on, convinced his improvised plan will still somehow line them up with the runway. Air traffic control checks in again. "Do you have the runway in sight?" The first officer hesitates, caught between honesty and obedience. "What should I tell him, sir?" The captain doesn't blink. "Tell him yes." And just like that, they lie to ATC. The controllers believe the aircraft is in safe visual contact with the airport. In reality, Flight 202 is sinking lower, surrounded by fog, heading straight toward the Margalla Hills. Every system is screaming for the pilots to climb. But inside the cockpit, silence and obedience rule, and disaster is seconds away. Flight 200 is now just a few miles from Islamabad. But instead of approaching the runway, the jet is wandering off course, slowly drifting toward the Margalla Hills, a rugged mountain range rising sharply from the valley floor. Inside the cockpit, the EGPWS keeps blaring, "Pull up! Pull up!" It's no longer a suggestion. It's a scream for survival. The first officer, clearly shaken, says again, "Sir, the terrain must be very close." But Captain Chaudhry dismisses him. He's locked into his plan, convinced he can still salvage the approach. At 2,000 feet, the Boeing 737 is already 500 feet below the published safety minimum. The autopilot is off. The captain is hand-flying the jet in thick fog, without visual contact, ignoring every warning system. And then, the inevitable. At 9:40 a.m., just 5 nautical miles north of Islamabad, Flight 202 slams into the Margalla Hills. The aircraft disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors. All 152 passengers and crew are killed instantly. The wreckage scatters across the hillside, smoldering in the rain and fog. Rescue teams rush to the site, but there is nothing to rescue. Pakistan International Airlines will call it one of the darkest days in its aviation history. For the families waiting at Islamabad Airport, the news is crushing. The flight they were tracking just minutes earlier will never arrive. A modern jet, a fully functioning warning system, experienced crew, yet the chain of errors left no room for escape. The crash of Airblue Flight 202 shocks Pakistan and the world. It is, at the time, the worst air disaster in Pakistani aviation history. The questions are immediate. How could a modern aircraft, on a routine flight, end up flying straight into a mountain? The Civil Aviation Authority and international investigators comb through the black boxes. The data paints a chilling picture. The terrain warning system worked. The aircraft had multiple alerts to pull up. The first officer recognized the danger. He urged caution several times, but the captain ignored it all. Investigators conclude the captain was suffering from cognitive fixation, a dangerous state where a pilot becomes so locked onto a plan that they ignore all contradicting information. The fog, the stress, and his determination to land at Islamabad blinded him to reality. The report also highlights something equally disturbing: the toxic cockpit culture. The first officer's warnings were too soft, too deferential. He questioned, but never outright challenged his captain. The imbalance of authority silenced the one voice that could have saved 152 lives. In the end, the investigators label the tragedy as controlled flight into terrain due to pilot error and CRM failure. A preventable disaster caused not by mechanical failure, but by human factors. Airblue Flight 202 became a case study in aviation schools worldwide. It was a painful reminder that even the most advanced aircraft are only as safe as the humans flying them. The crash pushed airlines in Pakistan to tighten crew resource management, CRM, training. Pilots were retrained to challenge authority in the cockpit, to speak up loudly and clearly when something doesn't feel right. The investigation also pressured regulators to review approach procedures into mountainous airports, especially in poor weather. But the hardest lesson is a universal one. Aviation disasters often don't come from a single mistake. They come from a chain of small errors, ignored warnings, and silence at the wrong moment. For the families, the legacy was not technical. It was personal. 152 lives ended in an instant, and the grief reshaped entire communities. Today, Flight 202 stands as a warning to every pilot who steps into a cockpit. Respect the alarms. Respect the terrain. Respect your co-pilot, because arrogance and silence in the sky can kill. Airblue Flight 202 wasn't just a crash. It was a lesson written in tragedy, a warning carved into the mountains of Islamabad. It showed us how ego, silence, and ignored warnings can be deadlier than any storm. Aviation has come a long way since that day, but here's the haunting question. Could it happen again? Could another crew somewhere in the world fall into the same trap of human error? What do you think? Do modern pilots truly learn from disasters like Flight 202, or are we doomed to repeat history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that uncover the hidden truths behind aviation's darkest moments, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us bring you more deep dives like this one.